Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Olson Day of the New York Times, and I am delighted to welcome you to this exciting TimesTalks. We're live here at the Times Center in New York, and we're live around the world on the web. Tonight's TimesTalks is a great opportunity to hear two veteran sports journalists, both named Bob, to give us their perspective on what's happening in the world of sports today. The first, Bob, who's tonight's special guest, has a fantastic track record in the world of sports journalism. His work has won the highest accolades in his profession, the Emmy Award, not once or twice, but 22 times and counting. And his peers have named him the National Sportscaster of the Year an unprecedented 8 times. We are delighted that he is here with us tonight for what is certain to be a fascinating conversation with our interviewer. He came to the Times straight out of Columbia University at age 19, and he has been writing about the intersection of sports and reality and many other things ever since. Earlier this week, Sports Illustrated nominated him as Sportsman of the Year and called his new memoir, An Accidental Sports Writer, a highlight of the year in publishing and sports. Earlier this year, Sports Illustrated said that in his columns and his reports from the front lines of the sports world, his irreverent questions and bold stories have forced us to re-examine the way we look at sports and life. So please join me in welcoming tonight's interviewer, Bob Lipsyte, and our very special guest, Bob Costas.
Here we go. Well, welcome to the continuation of a conversation that began 18 years ago. In 1993, when I interviewed Bob for a 6-hour TV documentary. I was enormously impressed, even then. He could have filled all 6 hours, and probably should have. But 2 years later, we hit a psychic speed bump. That was soon after the death of Mickey Mantle in 1995. Bob took strong exception to my coverage in the Times of Mantle's death. Later, he described as almost churlish that I brought up questions about Mantle's liver transplant at a time that should have been more celebratory. And I questioned his eulogy at Mantle's funeral. Over sentimental, I thought.
Bullshit.
And perhaps, you agree now?
Why? That was ridiculous then, it's ridiculous now.
Okay. And perhaps not seemly for a journalist.
I was delivering a eulogy at a man's funeral.
Okay. As a fan.
As an observer of his
Okay.
life.
Obviously, we have differences. After that, we did not speak again for 14 years.
But that wasn't because we were feuding. We had no occasion to cross paths.
Well, we then crossed paths right here. The Times brings people together. In 2009, he did a knockout Times Talk, for which he has been asked to return with me. In the past 6 months, since publication of my memoir, An Accidental Sports Writer, in which he is mentioned, we have been in furious conversation. Higher? We still have differences, but we seem to be reaching towards some kind of dialectic about sports and sports journalism with many, many agreements, I think. Okay.
We'll see.
Later, we will pick up our long-running discourse, which includes steroids, concussions, Howard Cosell, NASCAR, I hope. But first, we're going to take advantage of a historic moment in sports and in Bob Costas's career. As most of you know, just recently, he capped a justifiably acclaimed record as the best interviewer in sports broadcasting arguably I'd say in all of broadcasting, in an encounter with the disembodied voice of Jerry Sandusky, perhaps the most reviled man in the country at that moment. And next year, he will be a critical part of a new sports network, NBC Sports. If you thought that TV needed more sports, just you wait. So, at the risk of sounding like those typical sports reporters on TV that we both abhor, let's talk about how you felt when you found out some 15 minutes before the opening whistle that Jerry Sandusky would be on the line.
Well, some of you may have heard this before because I've been asked about it in a few places, but we had lined up an interview with his attorney, Joseph Amendola, who at that point we thought was as close as we could get to the heart of the story. We'd pursued Paterno himself, his son Jay Paterno, who's a member of the coaching staff at Penn State, Tim Curley, the deposed athletic director, Mike McQuarrie, who is cited in the grand jury report as he's the assistant coach who says he observed the incident in the shower with Sandusky and a boy of about 10. We had pursued all those people for interviews and were unsuccessful for understandable reasons in landing any of them, and we thought that Amendola was at that point as close to the heart of the story as we could get. I was even somewhat surprised that Amendola was willing to come up from State College to speak with us. I was even more surprised when about half an hour or so, maybe less, before we were scheduled to sit down with Amendola, he said to us, to me and a couple of the producers, what if I could get Sandusky on the phone? And I'm thinking, this doesn't seem like a really good idea from your standpoint. That's what I'm thinking. But what I'm saying is, okay, yeah, let's do that. And so the next thing I know, we're sitting down and they check the phone line and they confirm that it is Sandusky. And some of the questions that I'd prepared to ask Amendola could be redirected towards Sandusky. But another portion of it just came off what I heard Sandusky say. Both the content of it and the way in which he answered the questions sort of suggested the follow-ups. And that happened at about 7:15 on that Monday night, and Rock Center then aired at 10 o'clock.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of icy control. Maybe icy is too strong a word on your part. Here was this man on the other end whom you kind of nailed as all but called a pederast, and your face never changed. You know, your voice never went up or down. I mean, is that just years of doing this, or?
Well, I imagine there's some craftsmanship and some professionalism involved, but I was aware that the audience needed to hear from this guy, and then they could form their own opinions. You could infer after a while everything that you needed to infer. And if I had imposed my own feelings, if I had tried to draw attention to myself other than as the questioner, I think it would have only undermined the impact. It was my job to ask the questions. The audience could draw their own conclusions, and I think virtually 100% of them reached roughly the same conclusion. And I was also bearing down, just trying to listen intently to what he would say. At the same time, I also knew, just from the standpoint of television, just the dynamics of this, no one in conversation with another human being, even if it's an intent conversation, no one maintains eye contact with another human being for a minute at a time. You divert your glance, you look away, you come back. But I didn't know if and when they would ever be off of me. Because usually, if I pose a question and you're the subject, they're going to be on you. Then there may be a two-shot.
No
of
nose
come
picking
back.
that night.
Right. If I looked away, then they would catch me looking away.
Right.
So a good portion of that simply was knowing that there was every chance that 90% of the time, the only shot would be me listening. And I think one of the reasons the interview played in such dramatic fashion, in addition to the immediacy of it, it was virtually live. The story was just developing. People were very surprised that Sandusky and his lawyer made themselves available as they did. It was a story that had a lot of drama to it, but it wasn't a tabloid story because it was legitimately newsworthy. But adding to the drama of it.
But wait a minute, most tabloid stories are legitimately newsworthy. It's just the way the tabloids handle them. I mean, this was handled with such a kind of classic restraint.
The tabloids do have their own way of handling some stories that are legitimately newsworthy, and then the tabloids also create, and all their cousins now, which is half of mainstream TV, they create stories that are supposed to be of interest, but I don't think you consider what goes on with the Kardashians. Well, we're on the same wavelength here. We could have picked from a number of examples, and we each went to K in the alphabet. But I think one of the reasons why this played as dramatically as it did is it was so stark. This interview could have been done in 1960, except that it likely would have been in black and white. It was devoid of all the bells and whistles and all the little extra elements that television usually brings to it from a production standpoint, and I think that made the content all the more stark.
So the question really is, where do we go from here, like, kind of pulling back from Jerry Sandusky, who is really not that interesting a story, ultimately. The story really seems to be how this could happen.
Yes. Yeah.
And this involves all the things that you've been working on all your career, particularly football, athletes, coaches. I mean, you interviewed Paterno. I did
interview Paterno.
In a very warm...
I don't know him well.
Yeah.
I interviewed him for HBO in 2005 in what at that time was viewed as a different look at Joe Paterno than most people had seen, because he opened up to me, and I'm sure that everything he said was true as far as it went in terms of his life growing up in Brooklyn. He told a heartwarming story where he said he thinks he dated Joe Torre's sister at one time in Brooklyn in like the 1930s or early 40s. And I said, "You dated Sister Marguerite?" And he said, "I think so, and I'm pretty sure that's what drove her to the convent." Looking back on that now, it's harder to smile. I do not view Joe Paterno as a phony whose real character is revealed by this tragic scandal. I view him as a man, not perfect, not a saint, but who through most of his career, both as a coach and an educator, as a philanthropist, as an important figure at Penn State, through most of his career, he did abundantly good things. Perfectly? No, but abundantly good things. But somehow arrived at a point, a crucial point in his own life, where for whatever reasons, he was blind to a larger question than any question that he'd ever faced in his career.
Or that the institution
Well, they were both.
was more important than any individual.
The institution was more important. Perhaps the image of Joe Paterno himself was more important. Penn State football more important. Who knows? But a man who had lived, for the most part, again, not a perfect life, but an essentially decent life, clearly misplaced his moral and ethical compass
I'm not so sure.
in this chapter. And I think that when you hear the term that the NCAA uses all the time, which they actually applied to this case recently, lack of institutional control, that usually means that the athletic department or the chancellor or the president of the university turned its back while the successful coach of the football team or basketball team engaged in illegal recruiting or brought in ball players who had no business being students or overlooked outrageous behavior, that sort of thing. Here, I think Penn State arrived at a lack of institutional control by an entirely different route, because their football program had by and large been something that they could feel good about. It had been an acceptable marriage of academics and athletics for a long time. It got to the point where it was, oh, St. Joe's got it covered. St. Joe will take care of it. But they still wound up in the same place. Nobody was big enough to say to Joe Paterno and his football program, hold on, wait a second. They were more concerned with covering their own behinds on this than doing the right thing.
Yeah, I can't go all the way with you. In the middle 90s, there was a brief period when Joe Paterno was not only the football coach, but the athletic director.
Yeah.
And during that period, the women's basketball coach, a woman named Renee Portland, had a really wonderful recruiting tool. She would go into the heartlands of America, into the living rooms, and she would bring mom and dad to one corner and say, I can promise you one thing. If your girl plays basketball with me at Penn State, she will find no predatory lesbians in my locker room. This woman, Renee Portland, drove a lot of lesbians out of Penn State, softball players as well as basketball players. And she had a real pattern that a lot of other women coaches around the country obviously were very exercised about. I interviewed a lot of people and brought all this information to Joe Paterno.
You brought it to Joe.
Huh?
You brought it to Joe.
Yeah.
And he said,
He'll look into it, but basically it was totally brushed aside, you know? And that came back to me when this broke, the idea that there must have been other things as well that Joe Paterno, and some people, you know, rather unfortunately call him Bishop Joe because they make the connection to the church scandals, that he really felt that nothing was more important than his athletic program, than the football team, than Penn State, that people's lives were not important. And that's terrifying.
That could well be. I didn't
Yes.
cover Penn State on an ongoing basis, and I knew Paterno only in passing. That could well be. But even if that is true, it stands alongside some legitimate accomplishments on his part beyond wins and losses,
Such as
raising the profile of the school to where its endowment has grown, and even those who have not much use for football within the faculty and the administration will tell you that that was an essential part. The visibility of Penn State football was an essential part. The vast majority of his players graduated. Professors there testify, who had them in class, that they were legitimate students, not taking gut courses. Most of them, again, you can't have hundreds, if not thousands of kids pass through, and some of them not be ne'er-do-wells or worse, but most of them had some sort of legitimate academic and athletic experience under him. He tirelessly raised funds for the university. He gave out of his own pocket to the library and whatnot. He did a number of good things.
And the
like
cost,
most people,
so
it's
do you
complex.
Well, do you think the cost was worth it?
In the end?
Yeah.
No. In the end, no, and that's what's tragic about it. If they
Tragic for
the university, tragic for Paterno. Nothing's as tragic as what happened to those young
boys,
boys,
yes.
but there are subplots here. If he had come a cropper at the end in some horrible recruiting scandal, you could say, well, on balance, it was still a great thing. But this is so horrific that even with all the accomplishments and all the good that Joe Paterno did, again, as I stipulated, undoubtedly in an imperfect way, but there was a lot of good there. But this end is so horrific that it tips the balance. It's going to be very, very hard to extract from this story overall all the good things Joe Paterno did and still walk past the statue and genuflect.
Well, do you think that the Penn State story stands alone as an aberration in college football and sports? And I'm not talking about necessarily.
I don't know. I think it would be naive to say that. I just don't think we know yet about the particulars at other institutions. Some particulars have arisen at my alma mater, Syracuse. There are some similarities between Syracuse and Penn State. At the moment, the dissimilarities are much greater than the similarities, but we'll see how the investigation plays out.
It seems like you're going into a wonderful situation at NBC Sports. New channel. Your old boss from HBO,
Ross Greenberg, who's here tonight.
Did a great job there. And
HBO Sports was the gold standard
Right.
in terms of sports journalism, documentaries, quality sports programming apart from live events, although they did live events like boxing.
Well, if you
very
can
well. But
bring some of that dust to NBC Sports.
basically, the idea is to recreate the show that I was doing at HBO before I left HBO to go to the MLB network, to recreate the kind of town hall meetings that we did that dealt with a variety of subjects, to have the kind of one-on-one interviews that aren't sound bites, that have some depth to them, to combine some journalism with a presentation that's somewhat lively and entertaining. That's the objective.
Now, one advantage that HBO seemed to have had over NBC Sports is that they were not in bed with the leagues.
Absolutely.
So how do you walk the walk of being both an impresario of games and a journalist of games. I mean, you had some good investigations on the HBO show.
You know, I think it's only a matter of what the circumstances allow you to do. Some people said after the Sandusky interview, wow, that was good. I was surprised to see you do that. People who know my work said, it was good that you got the opportunity to do that. I could have done it any time if that circumstance had presented itself. The nature of network television sports, which does a lot of things extremely well, the quality of presentation, the camera work, the production value, many of the announcers are excellent craftsmen. They can present sports in a beautiful and skillful fashion, but they are just generally not inclined to treat issues in any depth. Part of the reason is that they don't want to offend their partners. Another part is that they've calculated that it doesn't hold an audience. Now, the audience objectives or expectations of a cable channel like the new NBC Sports Channel, or even HBO, a premium channel, are different. The definitions of success and a good audience are different. And so they could give more time, HBO could, and the new NBC Sports Channel will be able to give more time and emphasis to these issues. And I do not expect, I hope I'm not disappointed, I do not expect much, if any, interference coming from NBC's relationships with leagues and whatnot. I don't expect that to happen.
With a freer hand, perhaps, than you've had at network before.
I think so.
Yeah. Do you have a wish list? Do you have some things that you would really like to do?
Well, obviously, if we were on the air right now, we'd be talking not just about the Penn State and Syracuse situations, we'd be talking about the overall state of college sports. And we've already scheduled that as the second of our town hall meetings. It'll take place around the time of the Final Four. The first one is a natural. We'll do it on the Thursday before the Super Bowl, and it'll be about the state of the NFL. But in truth, when I sit down with Roger Goodell on that show, and we'll probably have 15 or 20 minutes with Roger Goodell, the only difference between the questions I'll ask him there and the questions that I would ask him if I had him at halftime or on a pregame show on NBC is that I'll have more time. You know, I think it's not my style to browbeat people or to be antagonistic toward them, except when they truly deserve it. But you can, in a professional way.
Who's truly deserved it that you have browbeaten?
You may get to that point before the evening's over.
I hope.
But you know, anyone.
Is there a magic word tonight?
anyone who's seen me through the years with Seelig or with David Stern or with Tagliabue and now Goodell, I think those questions are more or less the same questions that would have been asked had they been on Meet the Press or Nightline or 60 Minutes.
No, but you said browbeat or attack. I mean, I've never seen you with your hands around anybody's throat.
Generally, I think that that's not productive.
It isn't, no.
Generally, I think it's not productive. You know, I think leave me out of it. And some of this is uncomfortable because, you know, your work speaks for itself and people can draw whatever judgments they want. But this seems pertinent here. Your guy, Cosell, who did many good things, we'll get to him later, but your guy, Cosell, who did many good things, all right? If Roone Arledge had put Howard Cosell in Jim McKay's chair, or in that chair instead of Jim McKay in Munich, but Arledge was smart enough to choose McKay, had it been Cosell, it would not have been handled with the grace and the humanity and the eye toward both journalism and sensitivity that McKay brought to it. Had Cosell still been in the ABC baseball booth in 1989, when the earthquake hit Candlestick Park, he would not have done as good a job as Al Michaels, because he couldn't help but bring attention to himself rather than the unfolding story. Michaels did such an exemplary job that he, like McKay in Munich, was nominated for a News Emmy, something which inexplicably escaped Howard during his long and storied career. And I would submit that if you presented Jerry Sandusky to Howard Cosell, he might very well have figuratively gone for his throat. He wasn't there, so he'd have to just wrap his hands around the camera lens, but he might have figuratively gone for his throat, and that wouldn't have done much good at all. That wouldn't have served any useful purpose.
Well, you might be right, although as so many commissioners have said to you, Bob, that's a hypothetical, and I'm not going to go there. Of course, for so many of your colleagues in sports broadcasting, the chance to have some sort of confrontation is what it's all about. I mean,
Yeah.
And you've kind of looked down on a lot of sports journalism, particularly in broadcasting.
I think a lot of it isn't journalism. And by the way, a lot of what I do isn't journalism. My whole career is a hybrid of things. There are times when you're just hosting and you're trying to do it with a certain amount of thoughtfulness as much as the situation
So why
will
do you
allow.
get so annoyed when I bring that up?
I don't get annoyed when you bring
You
it up.
get very annoyed when I bring up the fact that you kind of walk this narrow line between, on the one hand, being a journalist because you've perpetrated some fine journalism, and on the other hand, being a guy who's bringing people into the tent.
Well, my only objection is when you imply that those two things are mutually exclusive or somehow they're necessarily at odds with each other. And I would also differ with the idea of bringing them into the tent. I think there are people who hype and hype and hype. I think a fair reading of what I do wouldn't put me in that category. I hope that people find the game interesting, but I don't go beyond my own level of interest in it. I try to have a level of professional engagement. I try to be prepared. I try to help people be well enough informed that it helps them enjoy the game. But I'm not much of an over-the-top guy. I'm not a bring you into the tent guy.
No, but I mean, you're a cool ringmaster. You have a kind of stylistic cool. Some people have talked, even given you an ironic detachment in this post-ironic age. I'm sorry to bring that up, but
Sometimes,
I mean,
sometimes ironic detachment is the best you can do. Sometimes in the course of your duties, you're not going to feel attached or have a true affinity for everything you're asked to present or comment on. And there are times when you really want to make that distinction clear, and then there are times when that's not a battle worth fighting, and you should just perform your duties in as professional fashion as possible. And then sometimes some distance, some ironic detachment, a little bit of a raised eyebrow is the best you can do.
Well, do you think that if you had worked exclusively, say for HBO or some PBS, some place that didn't have financial dealings with teams, you would have had a different career, you would have acted differently, you would have been a different kind of journalist?
Well, I would have done it more exclusively. It would have been largely or almost entirely about journalism. It's somewhat uncomfortable to speak about yourself, but someone said something about me once which I took as a compliment. They called me the Swiss Army knife of sportscasting. A Swiss Army knife, you got a thing that's a can opener, then you got a knife that's big enough to chop down a tree with, and everything in between. I'm proud of the fact that I can do what the situation calls for. And I just hope I do each of these things as well as I can. Call play-by-play of a game, host, do commentary, do interviews, occasionally do things when the circumstance allows that has more of a journalistic bent to it. And I think the only question is, how well do you do it? I don't think that a broadcaster or quasi-journalist should have to answer for that any more than a playwright or a screenwriter should have to answer, well, wait a minute, how come he did a drama that time and he did a comedy that time? Well, the only question is, how well were they done?
I don't think there's any parallel there at all. Let's go back. Let's go back to the.
But before you get to that, let me answer another part of your question. I think had I not had the sort of career I've had, where luckily for me there's been some call for my services on prominent events, then I would not have been able to parlay that into some of the things that I've done. Now, again, if I were truly selfless, I'd be on PBS, I'd be making less money, and I'd be tithing half of that to worthy charities, okay? But when it came time to write a book, I didn't write a collection of anecdotes from my broadcasting career. I didn't write a memoir about myself. I wrote about what interested me at that time, which was what I saw as the state of baseball. The publishers wanted a different kind of book and offered 5 times the advance for that kind of book than the one I took to write Fair Ball, which I think was pretty well received, and it came at a good time. The visibility that I achieved through NBC is what led to me being offered the positions I was offered at HBO. It's what leads to me having, maybe not as often as if I was exclusively at PBS, but on important occasions, having a very large audience who knows who I am, and if I can pick and choose those spots with some care and take advantage of those spots, I can make an impact. And as a matter of fact, Bob, I brought an example of this, all right? For the folks in the control room, this would be number 2, all right? This would be the concussions thing. Now, the point of this, to set this up, each halftime, I'm at the site of the game on Sunday night, and I do a little essay, 1.5 to 2 minutes, which they match pictures to at the control room back in New York. Very often it's just about some football-related topic. How is Tim Tebow doing what he's doing? Why are the Jets floundering? But sometimes it'll be something of greater substance than that, the death of Al Davis, or whatever it might be. And this was about a year ago, and it speaks for itself.
Dan, a number of the storylines in today's games involve what's becoming a more and more urgent football issue: concussions. Matt Moore started for Carolina after sustaining one last week. The Eagles' Kevin Kolb did not. On the sidelines in Dallas, Jason Witten got into a heated exchange with Cowboys staff after they wouldn't let him back in the game following a head injury. A week ago, Philadelphia linebacker Stuart Bradley was allowed to go back in for a while after a head injury that had him wobbling and then hitting the deck like a disoriented boxer. Led by the ongoing reporting of Alan Schwartz in the New York Times, more and more is being learned about the now undeniable link between concussions, especially repeat concussions, and subsequent problems with dementia, depression, early onset Alzheimer's, an entire array of serious medical problems stemming from an injury that is more common in football than in most other sports. It's not a pretty picture, especially given the increased size, strength, and speed of the players. Meanwhile, a portion of the football world, many fans included, don't just tolerate the game's brutality, they revel in it. Most in the league, including Commissioner Roger Goodell, are honestly concerned with the safety of players past and present. As well they should be, because here's the truth. America's most popular sport is a fundamentally dangerous game where the risk of catastrophic injury is not incidental, it is significant. In order to make it less so, caution, absolute caution, has to be the operative word with teams' approach to head injuries, even if it means convincing all the Jason Wittens that their competitive instincts and their devotion to their teams doesn't trump what modern sports medicine now understands. Changing the football mindset is essential for the health of the players and the health of the NFL. Back for the second half from Indianapolis after this.
Now,
Nice piece, but what's the takeaway?
The takeaway is this, and again, I'm not saying that that's the greatest thing ever said on that subject, but I am saying that few, if any, network sportscasters are inclined to do that. And few have as large an audience as I had there. I have to pick my spots. If I did that every single week, even though I might like to, if I could find an appropriate subject each week, if I did that every single week, it would wear thin on people and I'd wear out my welcome with it, so I have to pick my spots. My point to you, though, is if someone says, hey, I saw Bob Costas say that about the NFL on an NFL broadcast, on the most watched broadcast of the week, or I heard Al Michaels say that, or Chris Collinsworth say that, I think it has greater impact than if someone said it on PBS 10 times. And that's the trade-off for me. Now, I'm not always successful. I really admire and respect and owe a lot to the people that I've worked with through the years at NBC. And they do beautiful, beautiful work that often elevates me. And I often get credit just because it's my voice on it or I'm in proximity to work that really owes more to the producer or someone behind the scenes. But I've been frustrated from time to time when I argue that, hey, I understand that we're here to present an entertaining look at this game, but I think we ought to acknowledge some of the issues around the game. My argument has always been, if you took 10% of the time to acknowledge the issues, You'd have more credibility than 90% of the time when you say, hey, look at this, isn't that great? I lose most of those arguments, but at least I try. And if that's 3% instead of 10%, it's 3% largely because of me.
Well, this goes back to your the description you liked as being the utility tool of
Can you rephrase that?
Swiss Army knife. You like Swiss Army knife better? Yeah. Okay, so you're sportscaster, play-by-play sportscaster.
Yeah.
You're a pundit, which we just saw. You're a journalist.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, and you're a fan.
That part, you know, I was a fan when I was a kid, and most of my real appreciations are evocations of, not a lot of the time, but when it's appropriate, mostly about baseball. They're evocations of the 50s and 60s and when I was a kid, or appreciations for the generational link of a dad taking his son to the game, or a mom taking their son or daughter to the game, or how walking into a ballpark even today, even as the world has changed and baseball has changed, walking into a ballpark can suspend time for you. I don't think you want to hit that too hard, but I get that across sometimes, and I think that thoughtful people, not people just lost in some delusion, but thoughtful people appreciate that in proportion. I'm really not a crazy fan day to day in 2011. I'm really not living and dying with the outcome of these games. I enjoy a dramatic game, and I hope for a close game, and I hope for an event that is interesting, that I can have something interesting to say about, but I'm not there to excessively glorify the goings-on.
And yet you do. And let's go back to your point. Let's go back to your point about Bob Costas.
In order to reach a conclusion, don't you have to build a case?
Well, if you pay attention, you might hear it.
All right, I'm listening.
The concussion thing we just saw, you said that if a Bob Costas should say something like that, you know, once every 4 or 5 months or whenever, you know, you feel you can do it without boring your audience, is far more impact than somebody on PBS. First of all, I don't think that that's necessarily true, because the PBS audience may very well be an audience that can do something about all of this and might be more reactive to the issues involved against the people who are watching a football game.
Oh,
Second of all,
the ideal would be to be in both places.
Well, you come on PBS, that'd be great. Come on TimesTalks sometime. The other possibility is that Bob Costas saying, and I say this as you would say with all respect, Bob Costas saying that we need caution and in concussions. Bob Costas is also saying, we've got a grip on this.
No.
Bob Costas is saying everything is going to be all right.
Absolutely
because
not.
they're letting me say this.
Absolutely not. You're inferring that, and that inference makes no sense to me. Let me be as clear as I can possibly be. I like football to the extent that I like it, and baseball is my favorite sport. But I like football to the extent that I like it, despite its violence, not because of it. If you could somehow create a game where every tackle would simply stop the ball carrier, but never even sustain a scrape.
I think it's called flag football.
No, but flag football then would reduce the level of difficulty in stopping the runner. But if you could remove the violence and brutality from the game somehow, I would enjoy it more. Right? I think, as I said to Goodell on the air, I said, what do you say to the parents of an athletically gifted 13-year-old boy who tell you that they've been football fans their entire life, season ticket holders, never miss a Super Bowl, but knowing what we now know, we will not allow our son to play football? How could you possibly argue against their position? I think Goodell realizes that that makes a lot of sense. There's a limit to what he can acknowledge, and in his position, he's trying to do the best he can, both for humane reasons, the safety of the players, but also because he realizes his league faces liability issues. A lot of lawyers will tell you that the concept of willing assumption of risk indemnifies the league against these claims, but even as we speak, 12 former players have filed suit just this week claiming that the league soft-pedaled its own knowledge of the dangers of concussions and gave them drugs that sent them back onto the field and put them at further risk. So he's in that position. But let me make my position clear. I think that the violence and the level of violence in the National Football League and its celebration by parts of the media, I mean, up until recently, ESPN used to have a feature called He Got Jacked Up. And they had their commentators, some of them career announcers, some of them former players, chortling like drunken frat boys, "He got jacked up." And then they would say, well, of course, none of the people featured in these plays was seriously hurt. But the only difference between those plays and plays that result in catastrophic injuries, including paralysis, is luck and happenstance. And when you have a game where players celebrate, they don't celebrate good plays and clean tackles that Amos Alonzo Stagg would have taught. They celebrate the hit that blows the opponent up, and they stand over him and they celebrate it. Except when that guy doesn't get up, all right, then this ritual plays out. A hush falls over the stadium. Players from both teams join hands. Then they place the guy on a gurney. More often than not, as he leaves, he's able to give a thumbs up, and everyone applauds, including if he's a visiting player. The announcer then somberly says, well, that really puts it all in perspective. And that perspective is maintained for about 2 plays. And then we go right back onto the same thing, all right? The game is unacceptably brutal. Can I say it any more clearly than that? It is unacceptably brutal.
I think that's a very, very powerful statement, and you leave me no choice but to ask, so what are you going to do about it?
What I'm going to do about it, in my position, is on this program before the Super Bowl. We're going to talk with Goodell about it. We're going to talk with a panel of people about it. If I have occasion to do another commentary that's connected to it, I will. You haven't kept track of all the things that I've done, which I don't suggest you should do. I've read a lot of what you've written, but not all of it.
I've read every one of all the films that you sent me of yours through Screen. That's all I've been doing for 3 weeks.
3 weeks well spent.
I think so. They kept me home and out of trouble.
Right.
My wife was very pleased. But you'll still broadcast football. You'll still do NFL shows. You'll still sit there with Collinsworth and whoever and talk about the exciting game coming up.
I think
the reason I bring this up is because you brought up Howard Cosell, who, whatever you think his motives might have been, and I don't think that they were all pure, quit broadcasting boxing.
At the very, very end, when the thing had already played itself out, when Ali was gone, when Cosell himself was on his last legs, he didn't quit at the apex of his own career or the apex of boxing's popularity.
Okay, so we're going to wait another 20 years for you to walk away from football.
You know, I have some misgivings about football.
Well, I mean, that's a very strong statement.
I have misgivings about football. There are many people within the game, coaches, players, past and present, whom I admire and respect. And like anybody else, I can get caught up in the drama and strategy of a game and the atmosphere of a game. But a lot of that atmosphere troubles me. Atmosphere, not only what goes on the field, but kind of the tone sometimes in the stands and the way the sport is covered. I'm not 100% comfortable with that. Football is a very important part of NBC Sports. And by performing my function there, it gives me the opportunity to at least occasionally counterpunch, but also it increases my value to NBC and allows me to do these other things, part of which are propelled by my visibility, and I hope my acceptance by a large portion of the audience. If I were not as well known and didn't have the track record that I have, then it wouldn't be as easy for NBC to say, we're going to put him on every month with these programs on the NBC Sports Channel. I wouldn't have been, HBO wouldn't have been interested in hiring me without that visibility. So it's a bit of a balancing act. When you mention, you'll still be on with Collinsworth, every now and then, just in the course of a conversation, something will come up. So-and-so was fined for an illegal hit or whatever. and someone will make a point, well, you couldn't really tell, and he didn't mean it, and the guy lowered his head at the last minute, and I'll always interject. Let's talk about how fundamentally dangerous this game is. Where I can, I try to get it in there. I know it's not enough for you, but I'm doing what I can.
I certainly appreciate what you do, which very few people can do, which is try to make change from inside.
And when I covered baseball, which I feel more passionately about, when I covered baseball, I talked constantly about its systemic problems. I didn't, as some people caricatured it, do it when the bases were loaded and the game was on the line in the ninth inning. But I would do it when a guy was fouled off several pitches and then went back to put pine tar on his bat. And I don't think anybody else was doing that. I was trying to do it.
But the problem with violence in football is really that, and the long pass may be, certainly for the casual fan, the most exciting parts of the game. So talking about the violence of football, even decrying it, certainly is advertising the exciting aspects. What I want you to sit down with is this hockey commissioner, Gary Bettman, who talks about how the physicality of hockey is so important to our fans, just after the Times' fascinating three-part series on how the enforcers, the tough guys in hockey, are dying in their 20s and 30s.
When I interview Gary Bettman, which I've done before on both radio
You're
and
going to put your hands on his throat.
I'm not going to do that. But I would certainly ask him about that. And what he's saying, hockey's audience and its revenues are disproportionately at the gate. Hockey, at least in the United States, not in Canada, has relatively small television ratings, but they play to a huge percentage of capacity in the arena. So many of us who might think of ourselves as casual hockey fans may not be attracted by fighting that much. But their gut tells them, and their audience research tells them, that people who come to the arena to watch games like the occasional fight. And if they eliminate that, they believe they're hurting their own product. I'm not saying that justifies it. I believe that's their rationale.
Well, speaking of violence, let's talk about my greatest problem with you. And it's maybe insoluble. You wouldn't read the chapter about NASCAR in my book because you hate NASCAR.
I didn't say I hated NASCAR.
How could you hate NASCAR?
No.
They all hate NASCAR.
I don't hate NASCAR. Jeff Gordon is actually a neighbor of mine. He lives in my building. A very nice fellow. I don't hate NASCAR at all. I just didn't grow up with that. I just don't have any interest in it. To tell you the God's honest truth, even when the great Jim McKay was doing it, I had no interest in the Indy 500. I just don't have interest in around and around and around. And I certainly
Obviously, he doesn't take the right drugs.
I'm certainly not watching to see a crash. Which may attract part of the audience.
Well, no, I think.
So I don't even.
It's like any sport.
I don't even dislike it. I'm just not interested in it.
It's like any sport. If you got into it, got involved in it, started caring about the people, got to drive a car, I bet it would be very different. Maybe that's what we're going to have to do for NBC. I know how to drive a car.
Huh? I've driven a car.
How fast?
Whatever the speed limit allows.
Okay. Well, we'll get you up to 160 and see if you still hate NASCAR. Is there anything that you would want to talk about right now before we do that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, this is just wrong. The proportion here is wrong. I don't believe in false modesty, but this is Robert Lipsight. Right? This is just not right. I'm like a giant billboard here, and he's like a little inset. I'm unsettled by that.
Well, the Times felt you needed the boost.
And I appreciate it. And I appreciate it. I thought perhaps we would talk a bit about Cosell, because I admired Cosell greatly. You knew him well, and I only knew him toward the tail end of his career and his life, and I did not know him well. But like most people, I was amused by him. Some people found it intolerable, and I found it generally amusing. And I also admired his stands and agreed with them. I mean, I was a kid at a Northeastern university in the early 1970s. I didn't have any problem with Muhammad Ali. I liked Muhammad Ali. I did have a problem even then with the way he tortured Joe Frazier and diminished Joe Frazier. I thought that was not necessary and made no important sociological point. It was just cruel. And it was sad the way so many people fell in line with it because of the charisma of Ali. That was just the wrong thing to do to another human being. But by and large, I liked Ali very much. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, I was good with that. Curt Flood, I was on his side and Marvin Miller's side. So by and large, you know, Cosell's stands were stands that I agreed with, and from a seat somewhere at Syracuse University or as a young broadcaster, I was cheering him on. But I think sometimes people who appreciate Cosell, even as you have and others, they acknowledge that he could be at times an insufferable human being, but they appreciate, you know, what he did as a broadcaster, don't appreciate the different dynamics. The biggest difference, besides Cosell himself, between his world and now, was Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge encouraged Cosell to be Cosell, and he gave him places to do it. He knew it was good television. He didn't have to run off to HBO, which didn't exist then. He didn't have to just go on his radio show. He could sit for an hour on Wide World of Sports with Muhammad Ali. And even if people wrote letters then, they didn't send emails or write on blogs, if 5,000 letters came in excoriating Cosell, Arledge said, go out and be Howard Cosell. Partly because, I guess, he believed in the journalism, but largely because he knew it was good television. So he had places to do it. He also had issues that were more stark. You know, in the early 1990s, I talked about the dynamics of the relationship between the owners and players in baseball. And I thought I made what then was an excellent point, which is that the Players Association had gotten to the point where they'd won all of the important moral battles, and now they couldn't separate their own self-interest from what they thought was higher principle, and that's why they could never reach a deal. They were just so intransigent and so deeply ideological, but at the same time the owners were so feckless and dishonest that they could never come up with an appropriate counter-argument to expose what the Players Association had become. Now that, I think, was a true analysis, but it doesn't have you riding in on a white horse carrying a banner the same way as saying, Curt Flood is standing up for the rights of the oppressed players. That's what I'd like to think I would have said in 1972, but it wasn't any longer true in 1992. Cosell had Ali at that moment. He had Smith and Carlos at that moment. He had the emerging civil rights movement. He had the Vietnam War. He had Billie Jean King. To his everlasting credit, he was about the only one, not in print, there were a few in print, yourself notably included, but on the airwaves, he was about the only one that gravitated to those issues. But those issues were stark. There was a right and wrong. They've become grayer since then. And when one addresses those issues, it's more difficult to seem as if you're on a moral high horse about them. Plus, the world has now changed from when Cosell was there. People had 4 or 5 channels to choose from. When he was on, he had primacy. Now, even if someone does something great, it doesn't, unless they do it on the Super Bowl or something that really aggregates a very large audience, it doesn't have quite the same impact as it would have when Howard did it. And then the third thing is this. Howard Cosell was a marvelous personality. Even people who gnashed their teeth and said they hated him really didn't, because they watched them and in some sense they found it entertaining. Only Howard Cosell could have done what he did with Woody Allen and Bananas, interviewing Woody Allen and Louise Lasser as they consummated their marriage. Yes, there it is. It happened quickly, but it's all over now. It's all over. Now, you know, I had.
You could do it, obviously.
I had my moments. Marv Alberts had his moments on David Letterman, on Conan O'Brien, you know, getting off some good lines, doing some things in sketches, but not being this sort of almost cartoon character. Cosell was simultaneously a journalist, a great intellect, and a cartoon. And because he was that cartoon, people remember his pronouncements more than if he had done something that was twice as good and done it twice as often, but did it in a more measured style. That's the difference between Cosell and any would-be successor.
Well, I would like to think, because I loved Howard Cosell, as you know, I was the number 3 writer on a 2-man writing team for his variety show. What more could you ask for somebody? But I think that he would have found those issues, as I'm hoping you will find next year at NBC Sports. The corruption of higher education through college football and basketball, the violence in so many of our sports, the continued sexism and racism, within our sports system, the building of these Paterno-like, structures with no accountability. I'm sure there's no end of issues that people could not only discover, because they're right out there, but find people to embody them.
Let me say this. If you're just talking about the difference between quality on the one hand and impact on the other, I would respectfully submit that every episode of Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel is better than the average episode of Sports Beat with Howard Cosell.
I'm not sure that's true.
I'm very sure.
But okay,
I'm very
another
sure
difference, right?
And the quality.
Well, these
of,
HBO people.
The quality of those programs, journalistically and in terms of television craftsmanship, is tremendous. It's the closest thing to a 60 Minutes of Sports that you'll find. Now, is any one of those people,
is a 60 Minutes.
Gumbel included, going to break out as a cultural figure in quite the same way as Howard Cosell did in an entirely different time and place? No. But if you're just comparing for substance and quality, I think that compares very, very, very favorably.
Okay.
And I'll leave you folks with this. This, despite my small disagreements with some parts of it, this is a terrific.
That are about you.
This is a terrific memoir. This is a terrific memoir, and you would do well to pick it up. And Lipsight, although I think you should enjoy sports more, I think you can enjoy sports and still criticize it. And sometimes when people think you enjoy it, your criticisms carry more weight. But despite that disagreement of sensibility, Bob Lipsight is one of the most significant sports journalists of my lifetime. And long before I ever got into this, I had great admiration for him. I read him regularly, and despite our disagreements, I'm always interested in hearing his point of view. So I hope that we have a chance to do this again. If not here, then maybe on the air someplace or whatever.
The conversation goes on.
Exactly.
Thank you. Let's go.
I hope this is all right.
That's great.